Hey, welcome to the Ethics Experts. If it's your first time joining us, welcome. And if you're a returning subscriber, hey, bestie. I love your smile. You look great today. See what happens when you subscribe. You get a bonus greeting on every single episode. On this episode, we talked to the one and only Mark Jaffe. He has a really cool story on how he got into ethics and compliance, and like I say all the time, he's got some really cool tips on how you can improve your program and expand your impact. So I hope you enjoy.
Welcome to the Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
Well, I've been excited to get you on the Ethics Experts. We had a really fun pre-call, so I'd love to just kind of dive right in here.
Sure, let's go for it.
So you started your compliance journey in 2005, and you've kind of experienced a lot of different things, from regulatory work to high-level strategic management. Before we get into that, I always like to hear kind of your, people's life story on how you got into this space. Like, what kind of a kid were you? How did you grow up, and what set you on this path you've been on?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question. I mean, I grew up in a family of, there are three of us and my two parents. My father is a very interesting person. He was in the legal world, but didn't really practice law. He was for a while a prosecutor, both at the state level and in the federal government, and did some very interesting cases. But then he went to work for the Ford Foundation for about 20 years.
Oh.
And really helped found what is now, what was referred to as public interest law. So they funded the first public interest law firms, the national NRDC, the National Women's Law Center, really started getting that going. And then he really moved into alternative dispute resolution and working with mediation to resolve disputes. So he was always in a legal thing. But I think the thing that always kind of struck me the most, and my mom was a social worker, kind of went back to work and when we were growing up. And I think the thing that always struck me the most and probably influenced me the most is that one of the experiences that my father had was he was on the board of governors of Rutgers University. And I remember him coming home when we were, teenagers, and us having family discussions about, whether the university should divest from investments with companies who had interests in South Africa during that. And the whole kind of conversation about, I'll say, the ethics of that and the morality around that. And there were a number of questions like, in his tenure, like, should Rutgers become a big time sports program? And what I always loved about my parents, and, my parents are still alive, is that, they sought, it was a conversation and sought our input. And these were really difficult issues. And I think all of my siblings, we always look at it, always had that part, like, these are significant ethical and moral issues. They're not easy. They're interesting, but you kind of discuss it and see where you land. And so if I was looking in hindsight, I would say, like, that, I never would have said, oh, I'm going to be an ethics person, right? But looking back, now that you've asked it, like, I would say that experience certainly, was always a part of my growing up.
Yeah, you were kind of exposed to these sort of big questions at an early age, and that, some of these things are really just kind of exercising a muscle. No one is sort of born an ethicist. Yeah, that's interesting. So just starting to think about those at a young age, did that open your mind to this as like a possible track for your career?
I mean, I'd always been interested, in public policy and the law, I guess, in a interesting way. So I went to college. I studied public policy. And I went to go work. My first job out of college was working for the National Governors Association, that represents bipartisan the governors of the states, and it switches between Democrats and Republicans. And my 2 years there was very exciting because it was not unlike today. I mean, in a little bit different political way, but the two chairmen were very different. I had Bill Clinton, who became president, and John Sununu, a fairly conservative Republican from New Hampshire, right? And so, not that different. And yet, what was amazing is, the issues that we worked on were all ones that the governors supported. Obviously, we didn't work on issues that they disagreed on, but ones that they agreed on were issues. And I worked in environmental and agriculture and energy issues. And so it was really just an exciting, that got me going. And then I decided I wanted to go into, law school. But I think, I really like the intersection, I'll say, of law and policy and ethics, I guess, always thought about that. And so, in 2005, when I was at AT&T and I was asked to work on a data privacy project, I'd always look for new opportunities. One of the things I loved about my career at AT&T is I got to do so many different things. But I thought it would be just I knew nothing about privacy. I had not, really dealt in that area. And I spent 2.5 years leading a project to get AT&T, I'll say, compliant and in good standing in Europe under the EU privacy directive. And, working with business people, working with consultants and other folks. And it really kind of led to the beginning of my journey in the area of, I would say, ethics and compliance.
So was AT&T your first role out of law school?
No. So, I worked at a law school. I worked for a couple of different, I clerked for a couple of different judges. So, and worked in a couple of law firms. I started out, I had accepted a clerkship on the New Jersey Supreme Court. My family, shall we say, has a tradition. My father clerked at the New Jersey Supreme Court. My brother clerked at the New Jersey Supreme Court. So I felt
you got to follow those footsteps,
Right. I think my younger son who's in law school feels a little pressure now.
Yeah.
But my older son just graduated medical school. My younger son is in law school. But so I'd accepted a job there. I worked for a firm and I clerked in New Jersey. And then I moved to DC and I clerked in DC. And then I worked for 2 different firms in New Jersey before I moved into working for AT&T. So I started out really clerking, then in litigation, then moved into kind of corporate law, and then moved into an in-house position. And my job at AT&T was really helping the international business with all the relationships with foreign carriers around the world to terminate calls and wireless calls and the undersea cables. And that was my job. I was like on the international side helping that. And then that led to kind of a 2-year expertise in bankruptcy. And then it led to, being asked to take on privacy and then, a lot of different things after that.
How did you like the litigation work?
Part of the reason I moved into corporate is I didn't love it. And the reason I didn't like it that much, I loved I'll say, coming up with arguments. I got to argue a few things in court, but what I didn't like was how slow it was.
Yeah.
And the process. So I realized the whole discovery process and all that was just very frustrating for me. I loved the creative side of trying to, assert a position that made sense. I think the hardest thing for me that I think maybe hurt me in some ways as a litigator. I'm not saying this is a critical thing, but I had a really good friend of mine who was in some ways just a brilliant, but probably frustrating litigator for folks because he could never see the downside of any argument that he made. So people would just get so frustrated and settled. And my problem was I could never really put forward an argument that I didn't think was believable or had really credence. So I had one matter where I was representing a guy who had ended up having a nervous breakdown, and we were suing the insurance company and basically they moved for summary judgment, and I countered by striking their defenses and said that because the company had canceled the insurance policy. And so, we were seeking coverage under the policy. And the argument was about, well, the person was actually disabled. They were mentally lost it before the company canceled it. So there was no reason for the company to cancel it. So in the law, there was no consideration for that. And I ended up 50% of my argument was about like military court of justice cases about like when people send in life insurance cancellations while someone is in the service and it's mailed, but it doesn't arrive until after they die. So what do you pay out under the life insurance?
Yeah,
and
right.
things like that. And so it was just kind of an interesting. So, I would really dig to the deepest depths to come up what I thought was like, a strong and a compelling argument. But so I enjoyed that aspect of it. But I really did not like the
slog.
cadence.
Yeah.
The cadence of it. I'm much too pragmatic for that.
Yeah. So how did this experience or these experiences you had growing up, in the household you grew up in, where you're kind of getting exposed to these kind of ethical dilemmas, let's call them, then clerking, then doing litigation. How did that sort of confluence of experiences prepare you to for when you came in house, which obviously it has a very different, cadence and a lot more sort of variety. How did that prepare you for that? And like, how did you like that sort of change of pace?
I mean, I loved it. I think for me, I consider, one of my greater strengths is what I would call common sense. I have a very good like initial instinct and common sense. And I actually think like ethics in the right person is a lot about common sense.
I agree.
Right? I mean, obviously in the wrong person who doesn't have an ethical grounding, that common sense could be different. But for most people, I think that's a strong thing. So I love coming in-house because it was really what I most liked was just brainstorming a solution to a problem that works and had value. Right. And so for me, the thing I enjoy the most is actually the brainstorming of a creative way of approaching something that kind of works for everyone, that that you don't really initially think about, and that process.
Yeah, it's just like a bunch of little puzzles to figure out,
Yeah, and just tossing out ideas and doing things. I mean, to me, the greatest compliment I ever got, when you build, I love building relationships with people and collaborating. The greatest compliment I ever got was, when some of my quote unquote internal clients, one or two of them call me up and say, Mark, I know this is not a legal issue, but you always have a really good instinct and ideas and judgment. Can I bounce this off you?
That's great. Yeah.
And, I used to love that, because to me that like you become the counselor, the
advisor,
the advisor. And that's, and I think even, if you think about my present role, like obviously we have operational issues in that, but ultimately, my team's like the advisor of conscience. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a cool way to put it. And what I was struck with when you were kind of describing that is, you had to, your initial interactions with these people that later came to view you as an advisor, must have kind of created an opportunity for you to display this pragmatism and this sort of common sense, or these, instincts that you kind of alluded to. And, I think a lot of us in this space, the constant refrain is that like, oh, we're brought in too late, we're in reactionary mode and so forth. And, I always talk about the importance of building these relationships, not just for the connection point, but for the opportunity to like exhibit, adding value to that person. And when they can, go.
And I mean, look, I think to me, like one of the most memorable, and this is even before I got into, I'll say, ethics and compliance, right? It was when I was really acting as a main business attorney. I was working on a matter, actually turned out to be a litigation, like company moved in for a temporary restraining order. We countered and all this stuff, and we got it released. And the client was a really good friend of mine. Like, we were socially very friendly. And they told me after the court hearing, like, basically that they had lied in the affidavit.
Oh my
And I
gosh.
remember my stomach dropping and like, and just having, and, within, obviously not in the car with the person, but calling my senior vice president, who has been a mentor of mine for life, going like, um, I think he really needs to be disciplined. Like, this is a really good friend of mine, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I think we need to talk to our outside counsel. Like, how do we address this with the court? Like, this is, even though I thought the decision was right and we had a good argument, like, we misrepresented,
Yeah. Right.
had no idea, right, about it. And it was a really, when I was pretty young then, I was like, maybe 4 years into my AT&T career. So we're talking like over 20 years ago. And, just being really torn up about it. But I guess, getting back to like what I do now, I mean, I'm proud of the action I took.
Yeah. Right.
And the action that the company took. But it was, it was a really, it was one of those moments that, kind of tests you.
Yeah. Man, it's like you really are, everyone can make all these claims about themselves, but like it really gets tested in the fire, or it gets tested in the fight. And so what happened from that? Like, was that just kind of like a foundational sort of seminal moment of like a proving to yourself that, these things that you sort of thought were important, when it came down to it, you were able to actually kind of stand on those principles?
I mean, I don't think like I had an epiphany at that moment. I think like when we're having this conversation, I look back, obviously it's something that stands out in my career.
Yeah.
I think, but I don't think I like had an epiphany or anything like that. I just think it was, it probably revealed that part of I'll say my DNA that I use a lot more today, right? Not in that, maybe not in the same controversial way.
Yeah.
But really, and I guess if I had noticed it, I mean, again, how I ended up where I am today was, kind of just seizing opportunity. I don't know whether people saw in me something that might have suggested that this would be a good, kind of career growth for me. I've never asked them.
Yeah.
But I think the moment, and looking back, like, to me, that is something, and I also tested me because, I also wanted to remain friends with the person, but it did change our relationship, not like directly, but, slightly in an indirect way, because I was just kind of disappointed in them.
Yeah. Yeah. You thought they were one kind of person and you found them to be a different type of person.
Yeah.
So you join AT&T, you're doing all this international work, and then this opportunity to kind of dive into the privacy thing in Europe comes up. Was that, you think, what made that an interesting opportunity for you, or what about that opportunity? You said that you've kind of been opportunistic in some ways throughout your career. What was it about this new challenge or this new puzzle to solve that was attractive? And, what was that whole thing like? Because there was a lot of change happening right then,
Yeah. I mean, I think at that moment, partly I just had an enormous amount of trust in this one leader who kind of is really the only mentor I've had in my career. I would say close mentor. I mean, we're getting together next week for lunch, right? Like,
Yeah.
It's been a 25-year mentorship. And so I just had, a natural, like, you're asking, I'll do, right?
Yeah.
Kind of thing. But I think, if you look at the career, like, I came in, I did contracting work. Then I, did this bankruptcy stuff. And I mean, when I say I developed an expertise in bankruptcy, I led AT&T's for 1 year, the negotiation with MCI to resolve over $1 billion in disputes.
Jeez.
And I was selected to lead the whole thing because I had, so I had like this, I did contracting, then I did 2 years of this that I was, and so I kind of, I've always had part of me that likes the excitement of something new and a challenge and learning something new. So, it was, it sounded exciting. I can't say I knew anything about privacy, but it gave me an opportunity. I mean, I knew what privacy was. It was, at the early days of privacy, but it just sounded like an interesting thing. And so, I was more than willing to do it. And then, that after that kind of project ended, I still stayed in the world of privacy. And then I was asked to shortly thereafter, as someone was leaving, to take over the trade compliance work for the company. So import, export, trade sanctions. And then that led into, working on codes of conduct, whistleblowing hotlines, investigations, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and corruption programs and other substantive areas. So like that portfolio just kind of grew because, for a while, like especially for the international work, I was the only one in the company who did anything on it. So,
Right.
And then I began working really closely after the Singular Wireless acquisition with the chief compliance officer and the deputy chief compliance officer, and really how to build an ethics and compliance program and do risk assessments. And then that led to me leading efforts with integration for acquisition. So like they purchased a couple of wireless carriers in Mexico and DirecTV. And literally when we closed on DirecTV, and people still remember, like 2 days later, I was part of the main team doing ethics and compliance training. And then the next week I spent 2 weeks in South America going to 6 countries, right? Like,
wow.
And then, doing post-acquisition diligence. So it really expanded. And then, the biggest thing probably was, we brainstormed on how to reorganize and or how to evolve the compliance program there to the point where, we proposed and it was accepted that the chief compliance officer will become a direct report to the CEO of the company and, have a much bigger position. So it was, it kind of evolved.
So much movement. Yeah.
It kind of evolved. But part of that is like, I liked, I always did privacy work pretty much the whole time, but it was, small. I supported HR. I supported a lot of different teams, but I always had something new or expanding coming along. And that, and even in my present job, like that's to me has always been the fun part. And I continue to learn, like, I've been doing this for a long time. Like I continue to learn every day. Like,
yeah.
Everything you do, no one understands everything or how everything fits together. And like, although I'd been involved in investigations, like one of the great learning experiences for me in this job has been, I actually have the teams that do investigations. So it's a kind of a different, and I had been involved in some, but the thinking about like how to utilize those resources in the most efficient way, I'd never really kind of thought about, and what adds value to the company and what's not valuable. Because, just like a police department, right? You can't investigate every complaint, right?
Yeah, right.
Right. And same thing, in a company, right? You got to think about, I mean, depending upon what they are, what you do and what you not, what you get involved with and what you don't get involved with and what may go to other teams. And so that's just really a great learning opportunity.
I think you can never be great without the humility to know that you don't know everything. And I find that at some age, some people, they just say, oh, I've seen it all, and I think that is like such a dangerous place for us to like allow ourselves to get, because to your point, no one's seen it all. Stuff's changing all the time. There's new skills to build continually. How do you maintain that? Have you just always been kind of a lifelong learner type, always had that kind of curiosity and sort of thirst for more? You've obviously had a thirst for like more experiences. You said you like, change. Where do you think that is rooted in?
I mean, I think that's rooted. I think, in some ways I've matured in the sense of in kind of two meaningful ways. Part of that initial earlier in my career excitement was like to learn something new was also to resolve an issue.
Okay.
And I think one of my maturities, which might frustrate my team sometimes, is I become much more a long game player, in the sense that sometimes it's good to solve a problem by putting a Band-Aid on it, and sometimes it's good to let it bleed and come to a better resolution. It's better for the business to solve it and tackle it, even if it takes longer, in a more comprehensive way than to solve it so that no one thinks there's a problem when there really is.
Did that perspective just kind of evolve over time, you think?
Yeah, I think that evolved over time. And then part of that was also just as a manager, and part of the thing I love about my team is, I think if you ask my team, almost everyone would say this. They have caused me to change my opinion the most of any team I've ever worked with, and I have caused them to change their opinion the most of any team that I've worked with.
Interesting.
And so the healthy ability to argue about things or discuss things transparently, and not being so assured with my initial reaction, and them not, and I think that just leads to so much better decision making and approaches. But if you'd asked me, 15 years ago when I was barely a manager of people, I might have thought, oh, I'm always right.
Yeah.
And so I think that's, it's a process of being, one of the things I say that the hardest thing for me, is the decision. The hardest thing that I think about every day is, when I'm copied on emails, is, do I even intervene?
Right.
Do I intervene as a coach, as a mentor? Do I intervene as as an order or as strong guidance? And because everyone learns from mistakes, I may not be right. Why should I assume I'm right?
Yeah,
and,
right.
And, the whole point of having a team and letting them do things is so that they learn and I learn. And so, what is important enough, or what is strong enough in meaning to have those discussions or not?
Right.
And so, and that I think is, I would like to, maybe some people have it a lot younger in their career, but I think that is one of the advantages of having a longer career, I think.
Yeah. You can really kind of build that muscle, and you can see those patterns time after time to allow this new perspective to create this dynamic where it sounds like it really is an idea meritocracy on your team, where it's not just what you say, it's like, let's get to the right idea, which requires both, I think, like an openness from the leader, and also a sort of certain level of security on the team level for them to really exert, or really kind of, I don't know, push their idea forward,
One thing I always say is, look, collaboration and getting input from people has never in my life led to a worse outcome.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you can't do it forever. Even though we'll always get better. So you have to know, the hardest thing is, like, you want to get input, you want to improve it, but when do you stop getting the input? When do you stop trying to improve it? Because let's just say 82% is enough at this point for this particular thing.
Right.
As opposed to, some things might not 97%, in which case you might iterate for another month on it.
Right.
And that's also like partly an art, partly a science, partly a maturity. And so you just, I have some people on my team who want to get things out really quickly, and you're kind of sometimes trying to ratchet it back, and some people are like, I don't want to get it out until it's perfect, and which can't be the case either.
Right.
So there's kind of that balance in there. And look, I'm not saying I do it right myself, and I regret sometimes I should have sat on that email another day and read it again, or all those kinds of things that everyone does every day. But I do think that that's kind of a way of doing that. And if you think about it from an ethics and compliance standpoint, right? Like, and even, in our prior conversation, like, partly what I'm in is ethical culture in the risk mitigation business. I cannot stand when people say, oh, you're going to ensure compliance. The only people who can ensure compliance are individuals.
Exactly.
Right. You can set up processes and procedures to mitigate risk, to try to make sure that people follow the right action. But, at the end of the day, even for companies, like, it's not companies who do bad acts, it's the individuals who,
right,
make decisions associated with it that,
right,
cause bad things. And you're not there to do that. And so, what you're trying to do is set up predictability of performance in a percentage that makes sense for you, for your risk appetite, and in a way that mitigates things. Like, I always said, like, this was kind of a simple example, but, let's say you have a lot of vehicles in your fleet, and you're always going to have a policy that people shouldn't speed. But very few companies spend, let's say, millions and millions of dollars to stop their vehicles from going over a certain speed limit, unless you have people getting into a lot of accidents or causing a lot of deaths. Right. It's you could improve your compliance with that particular law by doing Y, but, like, is it really a cost benefit thing if you don't have a problem? Right.
Right.
Really.
Right.
On the other hand, if you have a problem in another area, like, you should be spending money to mitigate that. And so part of the whole, area is, like, trying to identify, what are most important to you, what are those bigger issues, and trying to do a risk-based approach to have an impact on mitigating that risk.
Yeah. I love what you said before. Like, we can't ensure compliance at best, we can ensure the circumstances, or, like, the circumstances for compliant behavior, or, but yeah, to your point, like, everyone is not like a robot that you just have to change the code in for them to, like, change those behaviors. And we can't control what all our stakeholders do. We can only kind of put those guardrails up and try to make sure folks are educated, and they can maybe start to think in that same sort of risk-based approach, with respect to their own actions.
And I think, it's one of the things that I've probably had, I'll say, a little bit more maturing for myself, having had the investigation teams, because the way I describe it, obviously you're trying to set good behavior. The investigation team is trying to quickly deal with those people who make mistakes.
Yeah. Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
And whether it's getting them out of the business or putting them on the path where they understand their error and become an advocate for change, right? It can be both those. Mm-hmm. And so I say, like, we're a medium-sized city. You would be naive to think that what happens in a medium-sized city, whether it's drugs, whether it's fights, whether all that kind of stuff, doesn't happen in a manufacturing facility, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So you're gonna have behavior that you may not think is great. The question is how you deal with that, and then is it a huge problem that it's disproportionate to what you think it should be, or what society, what's going on in society, or not? And if it becomes disproportionate, then you may have a lot more things. But if it's just, if it's kind of consistent with what other companies are experiencing, right? The point is to try to identify and prevent that behavior becoming much bigger by dealing with those particular problems or those particular people.
Right.
It's kind of an interesting way. So, and I really, although I'd done this investigations, I never really had that kind of opposite global view of, always talked about risk and risk mitigation and not being perfect. But this was much more eye-opening on, like, the percentages of non-perfection. Maybe not from a compliance perspective, but just, in a general perspective.
Yeah. It sounds like, prior to this, it was maybe a little bit more academic, and now you're kind of, maybe, going back to your city example, it's maybe hard to see all the litter on the street up in the high rise, but when you're actually on the front lines, you can see like, oh my gosh, we gotta, there's a lot more litter than I thought or something.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
What has been kind of, I want to talk about this investigation thing. And, you've kind of touched on some of the things that your eyes have been open to in taking this sort of closer, let's just call it interaction with investigations. I'd like to hear some more about like what have you learned from this experience, and how has your perspective shifted, in addition to what you shared, and how have you seen the opportunity to like utilize this investigation team as a sort of strategic resource with it, in the context of your goal of building a more ethical city?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, one of the things it has helped with, and, one of the reasons I agreed to take the team is it's really allowed us to operate in what I would say in a principled way. And so, like, one of the examples I give is, unless it's really a high level executive that I need to inform, let's say the board or senior leadership, when my team comes to ask me about a investigation, I don't let them ever tell me who it is.
Oh, that's good. That's smart. Okay.
Because I want to give an unbiased opinion, not knowing who it is or what the level is in the organization.
That's
because
smart.
To me, people should be the investigation should be,
unbiased.
If anything, you might say, maybe it should be more thorough as you move
Totally.
up, right?
Yeah, right.
And that's, I think, has been so helpful with the investigation team that they see that like as, it doesn't mean when it's done that I won't necessarily find out who it is, especially if we're going to take corrective action and I'm going to give some opinion associated with that. The other thing, getting to kind of the fairness, is I've really stressed to the team is like, just like in the world, like we should emphasize aggravating and mitigating factors. So if this person lied, they're one of the worst people I've ever interviewed. They couldn't even see the problem with their behavior and all this. On the other hand, if they're in the top 3%, like that's meaningful, right? If it's the opposite, like they broke down, oh my God, how do I make up for this? That's also meaningful. Maybe they stay in the company, become a really strong advocate for change. Right. And so those are important facts to give to the people deciding discipline. And so that's one of the areas. The second area is really just trying to think about how do we give the business information about trends? So besides individual activities, trends or gaps or learnings that are a little bit more, or other areas that like vulnerabilities that like our audit team or other folks should be looking at, so that, we're not just here to look at individual conduct, but also we have an opportunity to impact when there are structural issues where the company can improve, and trying to highlight those so that the company can make those improvements and better itself. So kind of a continuous learning. And so kind of taking that team a little bit out of, we're just, providing the individual, like looking at the thing and zooming out to say, is there a bigger issue going here? Like, does this, should we be improving a policy? Do we have a gap in a process that if we put a process in place, we won't see that, or, things like that. And so that's, one of the things I think with that kind of other side of my background and building programs and processes, like had really, I tried to bring to the table that maybe that those teams wouldn't naturally have done in the past.
Yeah, I mean, that's a hard skill that a lot of folks struggle with, the ability to zoom into the micro, but also the ability to zoom out to the macro and see those trends and see what these multiple data points are pointing toward, whether it's a gap in a policy or a gap in a process. Was that kind of new, you think, for some of the investigators that you're over? Because I'm sure they're not all just like first-time investigators,
No, I mean, I think they see it like, they saw it a fair amount, like if it was a particular gap in a policy that was relevant to the to the particular case. So I don't think that they didn't see that. But I've really stressed like looking across cases as a group where they might not know each other's cases.
Okay.
So like, so an investigator might say, oh my God, I had to be asked this, like, oh, our policy doesn't say this is a violation. Clearly this should be. And I always say, look, we don't have to find a granular policy. Like the code of conduct says as a higher ethical thing, like you're not supposed to steal. So all because we don't say, we say you steal a pen, that's wrong. But we didn't say you steal a pencil. Like it's not, it would have been great if it said, I don't know, that's a bad example, but
no, I get it.
If you stole a pencil, like it'd be great. But our code says thou shalt not steal, right? So let's find a code violation. Let's not worry about our theft policy for this one, right? But I think, causing the team and the leaders in particular to think across different matters that are related, that was not necessarily always, partly because no one had time, right? But I think that's, that was, a bigger change. And then kind of the other big change, I would say, is, kind of the ethical side of the code. So, one thing that, a lot of companies do is, we really try and part of my ethical side is like, we really want to promote a speak up culture where people feel comfortable reporting. And I started seeing like, we start getting, some cases that would come in where someone say, I've reported this 4 times. And no, it comes in anonymously finally to the hotline. And I was telling it, and I said to the team, like, if we come across this, we should open up another investigation of the person who failed to act.
Yeah, exactly. Well, because that's so corrosive to the speak up
right.
culture.
It's so
because everyone talks about that,
And I think, they hadn't really thought about it because, again, they're dealing with the bigger issue. But I think they really appreciated that because although you're not trying to get rid of that person and it's really a coaching opportunity and a leadership opportunity, it forces the business to deal with it head on. And so, we really try to highlight when there's other related issues where someone didn't act appropriately. And so that's really been it's made our cases longer and harder, right? But it also, I think, hopefully builds the culture of the expectation that, you all have an obligation to be accountable and to live our values. And, that's in every person's, like, it's not my team. My team's not going to make sure we do that. Right. Like,
right.
It's every, getting back to like the wrongdoing, it's every person's responsibility to do the right things also. And so, it's kind of pushing that, people to recognize like, yeah, our values is that like, you have to do the right things. You're not supposed to do the wrong things, but you're also supposed to do the right things.
Right. There's 3 options kind of,
Right. And doing nothing is almost never the right thing.
Right. Yeah, that is right.
Doesn't mean it's not the wrong thing. Like you're not affirmatively, in some ways it's the wrong thing. You're not obviously necessarily contributing, but you're turning a blind eye to something.
Yeah, it's trinary. On. It's not binary, but only one of those 3 options is like, to your point, the right thing,
Yeah. So, I mean, it's kind of an interesting aspect.
But, what else I think is interesting is, we were kind of talking about in general 2 things. We're talking about like a materiality threshold or like, something that's, not perfectionism, to your point. Not every email needs to be totally perfect. Not every single, maybe it's 82%, maybe it's 97%, depending on the risk of the issue at hand. But when that kind of mentality is coupled with this sort of continuous learning or continuous improvement drive that you and your team seem to have, I think it allows for a lot more assumption of positive intent and a lot more opportunity for those coaching moments, because perhaps that leader who had heard that, to use your anecdote, who had heard that, issue 4 times, maybe they didn't feel like that sort of went beyond the materiality threshold and they had some justification for it. If it's something else, that it's true apathy or they truly don't care or whatever, then you're never going to find that out if you don't kind of treat that as a coaching moment.
Right. And we wouldn't, looking into it doesn't mean that if they said, look, this is what I did, I spoke to them, like they actually did something, it's just the person perceived it as doing nothing.
Yeah, exactly.
Then that wouldn't be necessarily a problem, right?
Great point.
It's, my investigators are fact finders, right? They trying to find out like what actually happened, not, and make a judgment whether it meets our policies or not. But, only 45% or 40% of what comes in is what we call substantiated. That right. So 60% of the time, we either don't have enough information or what is claimed, we don't conclude actually happened. Right. So, or happened in a way that was a violation of a policy. It may have happened, but not in a meaningful way. Right. So again, all because someone says something or something, happens, and part of the reason, like when we launch an investigation, all we tell a leader is someone in their organization is under investigation is because more than half the time it doesn't prove to be a problem. Why should that person be tainted potentially for having a claim against them that may not be true?
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So we try to be very careful about that because we're concerned about all the parties. We want to get to the truth and do it in a way. But we also don't want to have ancillary ramifications that damage someone when it's not necessary.
Yeah. I mean, it's such an interesting role that you have, and that your team, your department serves such an interesting sort of position in the company, because you just have to balance so much. You need participation from people up and down the stakeholder stack, right? You need people on the front line to kind of share this risk intelligence, but you also need those people at the middle level. Also I guess across the whole level to like feel that the ethics of the organization are real, and you want them to participate in sort of pushing that sort of frontier forward. It's just a lot to balance, and there's so many different perspectives, right? Like someone thinks that, someone was insulting and this person wasn't intending to be, or they took it the wrong way, or to your point, maybe the manager did address it, but it didn't meet, the right threshold for the reporter. Mm-hmm. And then they're just like, oh my gosh, nothing has happened. And the manager thinks, well, I already addressed that.
Yeah. And I mean, it's, look, I have ethical culture. I have compliance oversight. I have now third-party risk management. I have investigations. I have privacy, and I have AI, and I have cybersecurity, right?
Jeez,
so that's my team. But what's great about it is, you think about like AI, like our biggest thing is about responsible use. Like it's an ethical principle, right?
Right.
We're not against AI. Our company's going to use lots of AI, right? What we're about is responsible and ethical AI, right? That it's not going to be biased. People are going to use it responsibly, are going to oversee its output. Things like that. Same thing, privacy, like, all these are a combination of the law and ethics, right? Because, like privacy, there's no law that says you can't sell someone's personal information. That's an ethical choice. It's a choice about how you want to deal with your customers, your employees, and other folks, right? You have to do certain steps if you want to do that. But the law doesn't say it's right or wrong to sell.
Right.
And that's a pretty fundamental issue, right?
Yeah, it is. Right.
Like, so, how you decide that is in some ways is what I would call is an ethics. It's how you want to build trust and engage with your customers and your employees and other stakeholders. And that's a philosophy of how you want to have relationships and what is the grounding and basis of that. And that's an ethical culture.
We spend a lot of time talking about just in general in this industry, we spend a lot of time talking about like what is the company's like risk appetite, which you can never really quantify. It's really just kind of an amorphous, thing. But we don't spend a lot of time talking about like the ethical appetite, which I think is interesting because there's so many questions that are in this gray zone where the law doesn't sort of speak to it, or the standard is, well below what we might, demand of ourselves in terms of the way that we do business and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always saying to my, I have privacy lawyers and I have a privacy team, and I always tell my privacy team, like, they should never be giving the business advice like this is illegal unless it, really is. What they should be saying is it's against our policy and our principles.
There you go.
Right. We've set out, we've gotten this approved at the highest level. Like, this is how we want to behave in a privacy way. The problem with what you're doing is it doesn't meet that.
Yeah.
Right. Because that is what we said we want to do. And that's how we've held ourselves out to the public. That is more important.
Right.
And so I believe than what the law says. Now, obviously, that's informed by the law. It's what the things, but I always say the law tells you what you can or cannot do. Ethics tells you what you should or should not do. And what you should or should not do, there's always this fun thing in legal ethics, that the second most ethical choice is what lawyers are supposed to do. Because the first choice is maybe against the attorney-client privilege.
Right.
Right. But I mean, it's kind of an ironic thing, right? But most of this stuff has to have that ethical component because, this is all about relationships and trust and how you want to live, your life. And no one lives their lives thinking every day, oh, well, is that going to violate this part of the code or that part of the code, right? We have a moral set of values that we all hold dear to us that really guides our behavior, right? Whether we know what the law is or not. Now, for most people, most of the time, that means like they're not going to come into material conflict with a law that exists, whether they know about the law or not. Right? It's not like no company knows all the laws, no
individual. Yeah.
No individual, right? It's really that moral, ethical value system. And companies establish that, right? We try to, that's what a code of conduct's about. That's what, and there can be differences, right? Different companies, just like they have cultures, they have different moral values. It's not a judgment on, very few places have a value like let's cheat and steal and make
win
sure
at
our
any
customers
cost.
never,
like no one's saying that. Yeah.
Right. No one has that, right? There's subtle differences. There are areas where things are, but everyone wants, you want people to behave a certain way, to respect people in a certain way, to follow, certain set of behaviors and that, lessen conflict, build trust, make people feel like they're, part of something that, they can trust and feel comfortable with. And that is, you think about the best, even compliance programs or other things, like they have a big part of that because that is what, drives, the way that they want, people to behave and hold people accountable and build those relationships that way.
I think that's right. And I think leaning into those principles can allow, to the extent that principles are underlying this code or underlying these policies, can really help kind of equip, individuals who, to your point, don't know the laws, all of them, right? To make what is the most likely right decision at the moment. I think that's really what it all comes down to.
Yeah, I think, like one of the things in the privacy area we're always thinking about is, we have one of our principles is to be transparent. Not that the law doesn't say you should be, but, and we hold that very dear. Like, obviously, you don't want to confuse people, but our leaning is always, let's tell people what we're doing.
Yeah, right. Well, it just goes so far. In terms of building trust, it goes so far,
Right. Even the bad.
Yeah, even the bad.
Or even the mistakes. Like there's or the obstacles or, it's the leaning is always like, and look, I mean, it's interesting, right? We're in a field where we use a lot of data, but it's a little different than other companies. A lot of our data use in certain areas is to make the world safer.
Right.
And so, it's almost a societal question, like, are you willing to let us use your data for the benefit of society to build a safer vehicle, to build a better autonomy thing so that drives better than the way people do, and things like that. And that is an ethical, I mean,
It is.
it's like the core of an ethical, conversation with your customers that, like, we're not, it's not, obviously companies need to make money, but like, if you think about the history, like, part of the reason deaths are down in America and other places because cars are safer. The technology has improved. Airbags are better. See, the way they're built, like, and so that has real societal ramifications that are positive and
meaningful.
And meaningful. And that has partly been driven by getting data to make improvements.
That's a good point.
Just like, healthcare studies, like, people give their data to do a study so we can help solve a cancer or another thing. And that's that's societally positive, right?
How has, I can't believe we're almost done here. I'm sorry. I just have one more question if you have time.
Yeah, sure. Yep.
So, you came, you had this experience at AT&T and now you're at your current company. And those two companies are at very sort of different phases of their own like growth cycle or their own life cycle, right? So your current company, there's a lot of innovation, a lot of change. You guys are really pushing the envelope. I'd like to kind of hear a little bit about how that experience, I mean, because you did so much at AT&T. So you kind of learned to ride a certain horse. This horse is a little bit different. Like, how have you had to sort of change your approach in this perhaps faster moving, perhaps more innovative, relatively smaller, company? You understand what I'm asking? Yeah.
Yeah. I understand. And I did a few years in between at another big company as well. But kind of a different kind of company. I mean, part of it is I took the job because I wanted to have kind of a different experience. And for me, it was a unique opportunity to build something where nothing existed.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, and it kind of gets back into the long game. I think it really, getting back to, whether my common sense or pragmatism, I'm a very risk-oriented person. And so knowing that you only have a certain amount of bandwidth to do a certain amount of things a year.
Yeah, you can't do it all.
So, every year, like, I'll go through my team, like, what would be the top 10 things we do? Okay, so what are the 3 we're actually going to do?
Yeah, exactly.
And
sometimes I still struggle with that big time,
And sometimes it's not like, oh, it's always the top 3 because number 5 could be something that the business is ready to accept more than number 2. So let's do that, right? Because it's easier to implement. It's actually easier. We'll actually be more. It will be easier for us and be more
impact, less effort type thing.
Right. And so, so I think similar things like building relationships and getting that along. But I think it's innovative. And it's fast moving. And so it's really just trying to be very risk-based. I mean, one of the things that's nice and was kind of different is, I've always been in companies where I was, let's say, building something that was newish, like privacy program didn't really exist at AT&T that much, in a structure that had lots of historical things, or the law changed, and you're trying to force change from prior practice
on an existing structure,
which offers resistance. Here, the nice thing is, like, and getting back to the culture, like, I have not remotely run into anyone who doesn't want to do the right thing. The issue is no one understands or knows what that is.
Yeah, right.
In the sense of like from a legal standpoint. I'm not saying
Yeah.
like from a moral standpoint.
Understood.
And so part of it is like picking those opportunities that are the most meaningful, educating people, and then brainstorming on solutions that allow the business to proceed and explaining why it's important to do these things. And that's a great opportunity because, you know, it builds stuff. You know, the downside or the problem is, you know, like any other place, like, you know, you always wish you had more resource. You always wish you could go deeper. And so you have to be comfortable in that kind of risk-based approach of, you know,
right.
I look back, it's 4.5 years. I was the one person, like when I look at what my team is and what we do, it's incredible how much we do. Yeah. On the other hand, if you're talking about like the climb to Mount Everest, we're not even like a quarter of the way up the mountain.
Yeah, you're still in the foothills, or maybe you just passed the foothills.
But like we've gone up a couple of thousand feet at this point, which is incredible when you think about it, right? Like, you know, in a journey. So, and I do like sit back and tell the team, because it can be frustrating, like just think how far we've come.
Well,
like,
that is always the struggle. That's always the struggle because, you know, you're just taking, you know, one step at a time and, you know, you're kind of looking at your feet. You have to stop from time to time. And I think that's important for leaders to do that. And you got to stop from time to time and say, look at the view. Like we've come a long way, you know?
And look, and I mean, that's to me, like one of the advantages of doing like an annual risk assessment or looking back at your programs. Like it gives you that opportunity to say, like sometimes we'll do maturity assessments. So let's say when I came in, like the first maturity on a 0 to 5, like we would have put all our programs at like 0.2. Right. Let's just say, because nothing existed. 0.1, right? Like now they're up the scale. You know, they're not in the most mature, but like, and that's like real progress, right? Like that's,
and it's tangible progress. Yeah.
It's tangible progress. Like there was no privacy policy. There was no privacy training when I started the privacy program. Like there was nothing. Right now we have people get trained. We do, you know, privacy threshold assessments. We do stuff. Now, are there lots of areas to improve?
Of course.
Certainly. But like just the fact that like most of the people in the company understand what the word privacy means. And when I started, they wouldn't have understood what the word means.
Right.
It's like great progress.
We're growing. Yeah.
Same thing like with a code of conduct, like our ethics, right? Like most people have an understanding of that. Like they didn't before, right? And it's not because they were against it. Like it didn't exist.
Yeah, exactly.
So, you know, so there's progress, but yeah, I think that's, you know, you have to, it's fast paced. All places are fast paced, in a lot of different ways. You know, I think, you know, the biggest thing is just to be, flexible, build relationships, try to add value, you know, try to discuss it in a way that people, feel like, you know, you're having an impact that's positive.
And I think I would add, like, build your pragmatism by really, you know, what did you say you do? You know, risk assessments, but also maturity assessments. We should be doing like pragmatism assessments on ourselves, or like materiality assessments on ourselves, because to your point, you're never going to be able to get it all. You're never going to get all the dust out of the room. And I think expertise is going to ultimately be rooted in knowing like what matters and what doesn't matter. And also, I think perhaps, go ahead.
Yeah. And I would say like one of the big things that I'm always stressing in my team, even from the pragmatic standpoint, and, you know, kind of gets back to the ethical culture, is it's not enough to just pragmatically say this is low risk. You know, you don't violate the law because you're not going to get caught.
Yeah, right.
You have to, if you have a reason like that really is behind that low risk, like it's really shouldn't be considered this, or it's really not the right thing to do for this reason, and that story makes sense, assume everything you do will be out in the public. So are you going to be able to explain it? Do you feel comfortable with your explanation? And will it be, even if people don't agree, will they understand why you made the decision? Yeah,
that there's some rationale behind it.
There's a rationale.
Reasonable or something.
And right. And so, you know, that, so if you decide, let's just say, I'm not going to follow X law because we want to help people save their lives by giving them information to the police when they get hurt. And we didn't have consent, but we're going to do it anyway. Even when they ask for help, like you might say, yeah, most people would say, that's a good thing.
Yeah, exactly.
And so if that's your story, like, yeah, we're not exactly following exactly what was going on here, but it was written poorly. And we believe that in this situation, this is the right thing to do. And that's your explanation. And that really resonates with people, or even if they didn't agree, but like people will understand that that's why you did it. That is, so your pragmatism has to be, I think, always in that lens of how you would explain it and be transparent with people about it.
Which is very freeing.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Yes. It makes it, again, that's a principle.
Yeah, right.
That you're trying to do all your stuff about, that people will understand. People in the company will understand, like, as it's not uncommon for people to say, so if a newspaper reporter asked you about that, how would you explain that? And if you can't answer that question, you got to go back to the drawing board.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They're not principles if they're not guiding principles. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
So Mark, I really enjoyed this time together. I probably could have gone another hour with you. I want to wrap up with.
Thank you very much, Nick.
I want to wrap up with one more tiny question. If you could go back in time and give a young Mark a piece of advice you wish you got earlier, what would that be?
I think the advice I would give is don't be so concerned about how other people think your career is progressing, but be more comfortable about what you value the most. I think, it took me a while to switch into that a little bit more.
Yeah.
And I think, you're living your life. You have to be, the most thing is be happy with yourself, be happy with your relationships with people, and be, a little less concerned, sometimes what other people think. I think the happier you are with yourself, the rest will come.
Great advice. All right, man. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the Ethics Experts. We'll see you soon.
Thank you so much, Nick. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.